but it'll be up there on YouTube, and I'll drop a link in the comments of the meetup too as well, so you can find it. But you can always find it through the big data, through Utah Geek Events YouTube. All of these are listed on Utah Geek Events. So, but yeah, go right ahead, Ray. You're all set.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Pat. Really appreciate the opportunity to present to this group. I've done this in the past, and I think last time when I did it at the conference, it was 2014. So that was the time when I first time put this kind of a presentation together for your group. Now I'm doing it again, but today you have an updated version of what I did at that time. So I don't think any one of you have attended the previous one, but I think you will find it very engaging. 45 minutes is a short amount of time to discuss, 6 or 7 major areas where people get tripped up when it comes to data. So I will be touching on the surface for each of them and giving you tips on how to deal with it. I will admit that I am not a geek. I do statistics quite a bit, but my software side is not that strong. So I will dabble around with packages like Jump, and Jump is a product by SAS, by the way. And then Minitab, you must have heard of that. And then I do a fair amount of coding in VBA because I customize Excel to do a lot of my work as well. So I'm in that kind of a camp. R is on my radar to learn, and so are a couple of other languages. So that journey is still in its infancy. So if you ask me a tough question on JavaScript or R or whatever, I will not have an answer for you. So I'm just being upfront with you. However, I can handle a lot of statistics and the insights that come from experience and dealing with data for more than 20 years, and the pitfalls that happen in the journey of taking raw data, converting it into usable information, and then how people interpret that. That whole process is where my expertise lies. So you will discover that as we go. So let me get started. And if you have any questions, please put them in chat. You can also ask your question. I'll try to answer it as we go. So the reason I do these presentations, particularly on how to not get fooled by data, is, we all the time keep saying that we want to make decisions, sound decisions based on data. But I can bet you the ability to make sound decisions and understand data is still at a very low level today. And part of the reason is the understanding of statistics and the understanding of that whole chain is not where it needs to be. We are getting there bit by bit. Some automation will help, but I'm not sure that automation will do everything, because if you still have the human element, then those pitfalls can come to the surface.
Hey, so Ray, we're seeing your presentation side again this time, the notes and everything else.
You're seeing the notes?
Yeah.
Okay. The ones that are appearing at the bottom?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want me to turn that off somehow?
No, I'm fine with it. I just didn't know if that's what you wanted to see.
Well, that thing is turned down because many times that's my default right now. So when I make these presentations, many times people ask me to keep it on.
Okay, sounds good.
If it is not distracting, I'll leave it on. If it is distracting, I'll turn it off.
No, works for me.
Okay.
Well, you've got closed caption, but then you have your notes to the side too.
Oh, this one, the one on the side. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, don't worry about it. If it is not bothering you, then don't worry about it.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So here is a little bit about myself. I'm an entrepreneur at heart. I started my entrepreneurial journey when I was 13, so it's more than 50 years ago. I've been in corporate jobs, started my own companies, sold them, done a lot of things in life. I won't bore you with the details. I also do a lot of work in the area of Six Sigma and data analytics with the packages that I just mentioned to you. I also write. I've got several books that I have published already, and I work with big companies and small companies. I'm based in Salt Lake City. Currently, I'm running this company called the KPI system, and so I'm a freelancer in a way. I do have a small team of consultants who I bring in on projects, but other than that, I don't have a corporate job at this point, and I'm not aspiring for one either. There is a lot of joy in being your own boss, so to speak. If you can live your dream and do the things that you really enjoy doing in life, nothing can be better than that. So let's talk about data and mindsets. When we talk about data sets and mindsets, those two are very closely interrelated. And what do I mean by that? The human species has a very funny way of understanding data sets. So let me walk you through a few things and then I'll get into real examples also. Okay, so the chance that you will not survive this procedure, this is a real question that was posed to a group of people. The chance that you will not survive this procedure is 5%. Would you like to go through it? What do you think? How many people would say, yeah, I'll still go through it? What do you think?
Depends on the risk. I mean, depends on what you get out of it.
Well, so what that means is that there is a 5% chance that you may not come back alive from the operating room, right? That's what this is telling you. So when this question was posed to a select group of people, many of them said, 5%, it could be me. So I'm not comfortable. On the other hand, if you frame the question differently and say, you'll still 95% chance you will survive this procedure, many people feel more comfortable. Why am I discussing this with you? Because a lot depends on how the same data set is framed and presented. And on top of that, the credibility of the person presenting it to you. And what do you know about that person? So this is where the human element and the interaction of the human element comes into the picture. Okay, this study was done by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. If you have not heard of them, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky have written several books, and I believe both of them got the Nobel Prize at one time for behavioral economics or something like that. You might want to look them up and see and read up on their work. Very, very interesting work is what they have done. So despite all this, we call ourselves a rational species. I'm not that sure about that. I think we make most decisions based on emotion, and then we use logic to justify our decisions. Okay, so that is the first trap that we fall into. And I'll give you a very recent example that is unfolding in front of our eyes right now. Some people may disagree with it, and I fully understand, but that will come a little later, so bear with me. All right, so here is something to look at. You know, the probability that a person may have a fatality in a car accident is about 100 per million, slightly more than 100 per million. The probability that you will get stung by a bee or a wasp and not survive, that is about 15 per million, give or take some. 15 is a reasonably accurate number. And these numbers are not based on anybody's imagination, they are published numbers. The fatalities on the bee stings and whatnot, that came from the National Safety Council website. And here we are debating the risk of 1 in 1 million of a blood clot. Okay, I understand that some of you may agree, some of you may not agree, but put it in perspective. Now, we are lucky that we have the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. What would have been the decision if we didn't have those? And how you present the data, how you present the information makes all the difference. So here we are debating 1 in 1 million risk. What should have been presented is what is the risk of fatality from a regular flu shot? Nobody talks about it. Nobody wants to talk about it. And these numbers speak for themselves. So I'll leave it at that. So I'll let you chew on that. Let's get into a little more detail on the statistical aspects of all of this. So I'll start off with a small story. We were considering relocating at one time. So I was talking to my daughter. This is a long time ago. And she came back to me with data and she said that, well, we need to look at the mean, we need to look at the median, what is important to you? Do you want to locate in a colder climate, warmer climate, so on and so forth. So there was a lot of family dialogue about relocation. And I said, I've never lived in snow, so I'd like to get an experience of living in snow, what it is like. And there was another reason. We had to start another company. So we were about to get funded. So we were doing this kind of a dialogue. So, uh, so she comes back with some numbers. And this is what she tells me. There are 2 cities, she said, and I researched, and this is what she said. I researched both cities, and the snowfall in one city is 47 inches average. In the other city is also 47 inches average, and the medians are the same. So the 2 cities, for all practical purposes, are identical. Well, should we draw decisions based on mean and median, or should we be looking at something else? That is one of the first traps that people fall into. Oh, the average of something is this, the average of something else is this, must be reasonably close. Not necessarily. You got to look at the spread. But even with the spread, you can get tricked, as you will see a little later. So means, medians don't mean a whole lot, although both are used very often. You got to look at the spread, and then there is more to it. So the first trap is just going by the mean. Now, this you can apply to click-through rates. This you can apply to total dwell time on web pages. You can apply all over the place. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. It is regardless. You got to look at other variables and other parameters, both. Okay. So here is a data set, the same data set, and there is the snowfall for the last several years. Can't go by mean or median by itself. Got to look at the spread. There is more to it. Just stay tuned. The next thing people look at is mean and standard deviation. Okay. So, okay, fine. We learned that the spread is important. Nothing wrong with that. Spread is important. But now how do you measure spread? So you can measure spreads in different ways. You can look at the range, max minus min, standard deviation. Sometimes people will look at the deviation from the median. I don't recommend that, but standard deviation is a very, very famous metric. You must have all heard about it, that people look at. So what do they think? What do they see here? So Sonia is a senior at the university where my daughter was a tutor, and she had taken one course in statistical methods. And she is convinced that mean and standard deviation are the most important statistics when it comes to analysis, because you get a feel for the spread and you get a feel for the where the center lies. So the standard deviation is a good metric because it takes into account the deviation of every data point from the mean value, as illustrated on this graphic. Great. So are there pitfalls here? Well, let's find out. Here are 2 data sets. Your mean is 5 and your standard deviation is 2.74. Should we believe that? Well, let's take the curtain off the statistical parameters that have been presented. Just take a look at what just happened. I've got 2 data sets. They are drastically different, and the mean and standard deviation are identical. You cannot go by just mean and standard deviation either. Sometimes you got to go look at the raw data. But there is more to it. There is more to it. All right. So let's go to point number 3. Okay. T-test is a very famous test that people use when they compare data sets. And the idea is to find out whether a particular data set is significantly different from another data set. This can be in the tech world, this can be a particular graphic on a particular page versus another graphic on the same page. How many clicks do I get? So t-test can be used in many, many different ways. In laboratory, you make specimens using a particular solution, you make specimens using a different solution. You measure a certain y value, the dependent variable. Is it identical? Is it not identical? So you use t-test. Okay, so here we go. So My daughter was in Berkeley, by the way. So some of these examples are from the stories I discussed with her when she was at Berkeley a long time ago. She did her master's in public health, and some of these examples are from that. All right, so there is a company that is making a certain solution with a certain objective of achieving CFU level. CFU is colony forming units, which are related to bacteria. And no, sorry, this one is on KPI, on the visitors track daily for a website. 2 weeks worth of data are collected and analyzed. I got mixed up there. That was the next example, which I'll go to in a few minutes. So web page 1 versus web page 2, both the means are 36.9. Standard deviation is 12.5. And the sample size is the same. Well, this sounds like identical data set. And the p value is 1. Naturally, it will be 1 if those numbers are so close. If those numbers are identical, your n sample size is identical. So p is 1. P is 1 means there is no statistical difference between those two samples. Sample 1 or test 1, web page 1 versus web page 2 are supposed to be identical. Well, let's chew on that. T-test gives a value of 1, which is the maximum possible. Kim says both are equally good. Would you agree? This is what the data was. This is exactly what the data was telling you. They are totally different. What did we learn? We just found out that you cannot go by mean alone. You cannot go by median alone. You cannot go by just standard deviation. Even with t-test, you can get tripped up. So you got to look at the graphics. How is the data over a period of time, particularly if there is a temporal effect, which is true in many cases. So you got to understand the nature of the raw data from which these statistics are being calculated. Okay? If you don't do that, then it can be extremely misleading to interpret what is going on. So t-test by itself, in addition to the other things that we discussed, is not enough. You got to look at what the data is beginning to look like. Now we will look at a situation where, whether it's a scientist or whether it's a data scientist, doesn't matter, where we are trying to establish correlations and associations and then try to understand cause and effect, okay? And build models to make some predictions. So many times to accomplish this, what is done is you take the variables and the data associated with those variables. So one is the dependent variable, the other is the independent variable, which is the x, the dependent is typically y. And you try to collect the data in pairs. For this value of x, you have this value of y. For this value of x, you have this value of y. And then try to establish a correlation. Typically, correlations are established using a parameter called R, which is the coefficient of correlation, or sometimes you use R squared, which tells you what percentage of the change in Y is associated with a certain change in X. Okay, so that is what R squared is about. So let us see what happens when we do this with R squared. In this particular case, they were studying the effect of different parameters, variables in the solution on the colony forming units, which is a measure of the bacterial activity. And they were trying to find out which particular factor is the key factor in promoting CFUs or controlling CFUs. And the idea was to study temperature, dilution factor of the solution, and time. These are typical factors which affect the total number of CFU count. Here is what they found. So they had a data set. It was an exploratory study, so the data set is very small. This is what they found. And they created a few simple linear equations. And based on the linear equations and the R squared values, they tried to draw some conclusions. But in every case, the CFUs increased with an increase in X. So in every single case, the slope was positive with an increase in time, with an increase in the dilution factor, with an increase in the temperature, the CFUs just increased. Or so they thought, because that's what the data is telling you. How do researchers, how do those who interpret data, how do they try to put their head around all of this? What factors do they look at? So many times they will look at what is called the R squared. In addition to the R squared, there is also the slope, which is M, and then there is the constant, which is the y-intercept. If you purely look at R squared in this particular case, your highest R squared is occurring with the variable time, that is 0.91. Your M is 4.05 and your y-intercept is 18. In this particular case, because the R squared was the highest, her conclusion was that is the one that we want to look at. That is the variable that we want to control so that we can control the CFUs. And also because the slope is very high. But what about this y-intercept? If the y-intercept is very high, what does that tell you? Well, if you go back and study the graph and put 2 and 2 together, this tells you that at time 0, I have got 18 CFUs to begin with. At time 0, 18 CFUs. And that is not supported by any of the other models. Does it mean that we had a contaminated solution to begin with? See, in many packages, it is up to you to choose what will be the y-intercept. When you create a model, let's say you collected some data and now you are going to create a model out of that data. It's your choice whether to use the y-intercept as 0 or let the y-intercept be calculated based on the least squares fit, which is what the R square will try to do. There is no rhyme and reason why the CFU, the bacterial colony forming unit count, should be 18 at time 0. So clearly, this was an error that was committed. And even though your R squared was high, it didn't mean a whole lot. It didn't mean a whole lot. In fact, the whole thing may not have been linear. But that is a decision the scientist or the engineer has to make. And if you don't know what the raw data is about, what the whole basic process is about, and what is the science operating behind is about, it's very easy to make these mistakes. I just saw this mistake happening for a major FDA submission just about 3-4 weeks ago. Luckily, I found it before it was submitted. Otherwise, it would have become a problem in the regulatory submission. When the FDA would have come back and asked some questions, this company would have been very hard pressed to explain why their slope is not, why their intercept is not 0. There are other factors as well. So the other thing you have to look at is what is the spread. When you do the R squared fit, you still need to look at the spread. And then you need to calculate the coefficient of variation against the Y factor. Because the coefficient of variation will tell you how much spread is there in the data. And if the spread is very high, then you can't trust those values. Even though your R squared might be high, you can't trust those values. So although packages are good, but we got to look a little beyond that and do some creative thinking about it and look at the data and then ask ourselves some hard questions. R squared by itself, neither slope, neither the y-intercept. They are good, don't get me wrong, but you can still get tripped up. Let me go back for a second and explain to you what I mean by the spread. Let me show you those graphs for a second. See how this spread is, this one data point is sitting over here. This spread, compare these spreads, the spreads are not identical. Now, at the same time, although this one looks tightly knit together, but you need to pay attention to the y-axis. The scaling on the y-axis is very different in each case. So that is why you got to look at the coefficient of variation of this data set with regard to the y parameter. Without that, it's very easy to get misled by the appearance of the data and the R squared and M and C. You got to calculate the coefficient of variation. That's the message I'm trying to give you. Okay, let's move on then. Trap number 5. Along with regression, once you do the fit with R squared, there is a thing called residuals. So even if you got a high R squared, you just cannot take it at face value, because is there another factor that is lurking in the background that we have not accounted for? If the data has no other factor in the background that is operating, then the total of the residuals will exhibit a normal distribution. Otherwise, it will exhibit a pattern. So what you need to do is you need to look at the residuals. In this particular case, the regression equation was calculated, R squared was pretty good. But when we looked at the residuals did not show what a normal distribution residual data set would show. This is what the normal distribution data set would show in terms of residuals. Whereas here we had a pattern. Now, how to decipher this pattern is a different matter. But the moment you observe a pattern, you need to be asking some hard questions. Okay, my residuals are not showing meaningless scatter. They are showing a pattern. So what is going on? What did I miss? Was there a systemic bias? Was there another variable that I need to look at? That needs to be examined. If your data set is clean and you really got that key variable captured in the R squared and the equation, then your residuals will exhibit normal distribution. Let me move on. So that by itself, best fit curve and model doesn't do justice. Let me put it that way. Okay, now we will talk about ordinal data. What is ordinal data? Ordinal data is the touchy-feely data that we collect all the time. For all kinds of things, we collect ordinal data. Ordinal data is very often turned into a number, okay? So you have done many different surveys, right? How are you feeling today? Not feeling good, just so-so, feeling very good, elated. I am in heaven. So now you have got 5 different answers and they are rated on a scale from 1 to 5. And then people start doing all kinds of statistics on that. Sometimes the scales will go from 1 to 7, and that's okay. You can choose whatever scale makes sense to you. But does it really lend itself to applying these statistics? Can I say that this experience had an average of 3.5 and this experience had an average of 7 on a scale of 1 to 10, and really put faith in those numbers? What is wrong with that? Well, there is a lot wrong with that. I'll tell you what is wrong with that. So let's go take a look at that. Okay, so 1 versus 2. So does it mean that the experience that gave a score of 2 was twice as better? 2 versus 4. The experience that gave me a score of 4, was that twice as better than 2? How do you quantify that? You can't. So trying to do those kinds of statistical approaches descriptive stats on ordinal data is a terrible, terrible mistake. And trying to draw conclusions based on this is even a bigger mistake. What do you have to do? You have to switch to what is called non-parametric methods. And that regime is totally a different regime of how to look at data and analyze data. So stay away from crunching numbers, those numbers which come from a foundation of touchy-feely inputs, where the source is not grounded in hard numerical scientific basis. You can convert touchy-feely information into numerical values, but it doesn't mean that you can really start running descriptive stats the way I just described. You got to use non-parametric methods. So that was mistake number 6. Okay. A/B testing is something that y'all are probably familiar with. Recently, I was given this situation to study and find out what was going wrong. So this company had previously evaluated 2 different buttons and found out, so there was a lot of data from other pages that they had created, and they found out that button A had a much more favorable response in CTRs, click-through rates, compared to button B. Okay, and you can replace the word button for image or a particular graphic or whatever. You know what A/B testing is. People do it all the time, and many people think that that is the greatest thing happening in the tech industry, and marketeers like it, and so on and so forth. But don't get me wrong, A/B testing is good, but you've got to realize that how do you really understand and interpret the data that comes out of A/B testing, and what is it that you need to look at beyond the first appearance from that data? That is what we need to look at. So here it is. On a landing page, they decided to use button style A, and they launched it. Mistake number 1, launched it right away. You don't want to do that. Anyway, they launched it. The click-through rate results were dismal. They had borrowed other elements from other pages which were supposedly good, and they thought that everything is going to work out fine, and button A, we know, or graphic A, whichever words you want to put there, doesn't matter. Button style B, when they tried to use the button style B, that didn't show any improvement either. So now they were at a loss as to what is really going on. So what could be other variables that could affect the CTR? When I looked at the web page, at their landing page, anytime you present information, particularly if it is text, one of the first things that needs to be done is to look at the readability of the content. I don't know if you are familiar with Fleshman-Kincaid reading scores. There are different types of evaluations you can do on the readability of content. If your audience is by and large, up to bachelor's level or lower, you want the content to be written at about an 8th grade, 7th, 8th grade level. If your audience is mostly PhDs and they read content which is 7th, 8th grade level, you're not going to win any brownie points from them. You got to know your audience. So readability of the content is a key factor with regard to the text on your page. So know your audience and then design it according to that. In some cases, you may want to write it at 5th or 6th grade level, not even 7th and 8th, 5th or 6th grade level, because your audience may not be there. Now, you may say that, well, people are graduates, people went through high school, this, that, and the other. Yes, I agree. But 2, 3, 4 years after you finish your degree or your graduation from high school or whatever, your reading scores start dropping. So you may be reading at a 10th grade level while you were in school, but 3, 4, 5 years down the road, you will not be reading at 10th grade level. I can guarantee you that. That thing drops off over a period of time. You got to take that into account. If you're dealing with senior citizens, the whole thing changes. The other was how many number of complex concepts were being presented in a given amount of real estate. And when I say real estate, it is the visual that the person is looking at. How many complex concepts are being presented? The more number of complex concepts, the less will be the visiting time on that page. And the third is the white space. So when we looked at those critically, here is what we found. We had to do a few experiments to determine this. And what we found is that the readability of the content was off the charts. The readability of the content, when I analyzed it, it came up to grade 18. And the audience was nowhere near having that kind of a readability, that capable in readability or comprehension. So those are important things that we need to pay attention to. The t-test and the p-values don't mean anything unless you really know what is going on. So lift the curtain, look behind the curtain. And I'll leave you with one final thought. There is a massive asymmetry. This is point number 8. This is a bonus for those of you who are still with me. There is a massive asymmetry between data and risk. And that asymmetry is shown on this diagram. And if I have to kind of condense it in a few words, basically it means the pain of loss is felt much more severely than the potential pleasure from a gain. That is why people buy lottery tickets. Losing $1 or $2 or $10 or $50 for the pleasure of an anticipation that they will win 10, 20, 30, 40 million, they'll spend that. And you know who spends the most on lottery tickets? It is that segment of the population that can least afford to throw money away like that. So the understanding of risk, the understanding of data is still not where we want it to be. The same is the case with this 1 in 1 million chance of getting a blood clot. Chew on that. Finally, how do we go from data to sound decisions? There is the data source, which is where the data comes from. This could be an experiment that you conducted. Your data could be coming from an instrument. Your data could be coming from surveys which are conducted on the web. So that is your source. That source delivers some data to you. That data may be numerical, it may be quantitative, it may be qualitative. Be aware that qualitative data, even though you change it to numbers, doesn't really become quantitative data. It masquerades as quantitative data. After that, there is the processing that takes place. This processing could be automated or it could be manual. This data is just data. The source may have the human element in it. After processing, there is the presentation of the data. Here is where your framing comes into picture. Here is where your graphics come into the picture. This presentation is a mix between the human element and the software packages that you use. And so is processing, because in the software packages, either you will write the algorithm or you will use a canned algorithm. Remember, I was saying, should the intercept be 0 or should it not? That is a decision you make. So there is that presentation over here, which again is a blend of the software package that you use and your decision on how you are going to present it, how you are going to frame the data. And finally, there is the interpretation. I just covered a few pitfalls here and there. I just picked 7 of them. Some of them were in this area presentation. Some of them were here in the processing area. I did not cover with you what are the pitfalls in the raw data itself, and I covered a little bit of the source with you. But when I make a full list of all the pitfalls across this whole spectrum, that list adds up to many, many factors, and that list is not complete. I'm still working on it. When I have it more complete, I'll share that with you in the future. I appreciate your time. I'm open to questions.
So the one comment we had is, I believe Fitz posted when you were talking about the tickets. He mentioned the lottery. He mentioned a tax on the mathematically illiterate.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, very true.
Very
Statistically
true,
and
Fitz.
mathematically illiterate, both. Yeah, statistically and mathematically illiterate. The level of statistical ignorance is, honestly speaking, appalling. I am so sorry to say that, but it is totally, totally appalling. And all I can say is our educational system needs to do better. That's all I can say.
Well, I will happily admit that I bought a scratch off while I was in Washington for the fun of it. They are truly, it's truly when you know exactly what's going on and that you have no chance, it's just fun. And hey, supporting the local tax system is what I was doing.
Yeah. And the funny thing is governments will promote it because that goes to the government's bottom line too, right? So the governments will promote it.
Yep.
Anyway,
Totally true.
yeah. Okay. Hopefully this was some value to you. If you have questions, I'm happy to entertain your questions and or discuss more if you like.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead, John, and then there's one in the chat. So go ahead, John.
So a lot of times with the data that I use a lot, I use like a z-score. So like when you're talking about measuring about a mean or whatever, and that's when it's normally distributed. What do you do when it's something other than something that's normally distributed? Not so much like taking a log of it or anything, but if you have like a gamma or beta distribution or something like that, what's a good equivalent to a z-score for something like that?
Okay, so that gets very convoluted, and here is what I do. I'll share with you what I do. The first test I run when I see that a data is not normally distributed, my concern is how far away from normal is it? So I'll give you 3 numbers if you can very easily, I think you can very easily remember those. The properties of a normal distribution are plus minus, if you go plus minus 1 standard deviation from the mean, you should be covering 68% of the data. Okay, you go to plus minus 2 standard deviations, you will cover 95% of the data, and plus minus 3 standard deviations, you will cover more than 99.7% of the data, give or take some. So what I do is I take a look at the data. First, I graph it out. If it doesn't look normal, I run that test of 1, 2, and 3 standard deviation. If it still fits within that, then I realize that, okay, it has slightly non-normal characteristics, but at a gross level, at a macro level, it is still reasonably close. Okay, so if it doesn't pass that, then I will worry about either applying a normal transformation to it, or I will invoke the central limit theorem, and I will do sampling from that data. Because when you do sampling from that data and you study the sample means, the larger your sample size, the more the means will come close to being normally distributed. So that is my preferred way of dealing with non-normal data. I hope that answers your question.
It does. I guess I was trying to figure out some calculation that I could do, as like the mean minus the.
So I believe in keeping life simple. The other way I will deal with non-normal, and I do that sometimes, is I will look at a percentile based analysis. So I'll create the percentile curve and I'll use that to figure out what is going on and where do I need to be.
Okay.
Which I do for the stock market very often, by the way. I'm an avid investor We'll do that some other time. I think you'll get a kick out of that in the future. We'll leave it for the next presentation. Okay, what is the other question here? Let me read.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. Any recommendations for introductory material on statistics? My goodness, there are so many books on statistical methods. So many books, it is just amazing. If you send me your contact information, I'm happy to give you some of the textbook names that I have. My collection is very big, so I'll have to go look it up. Also, it depends on what your interest is, your descriptive, predictive models, what your interest is, because on the topic of regression and residual analysis itself, there are probably more than 40 or 50 books. But not every book on statistical methods is going to take you into residuals and deep regression approaches. Then there are books on multivariate analysis, DOEs. All of those are under the umbrella of statistics. So it all depends on where you are and where do you want to go. So you have my contact information. If not, Pat can provide it to you. And I'm happy to share with you my collection of books if you please contact me. Or I can put it here if you like. Let me put my contact information here just in case any of you would feel like touching base with me. I'm happy to. And please reference our meeting today. Then I'll be happy to provide further information that you may want. Let me look at the next question. Trevor was super helpful. Okay, same type of question. So I think I answered both questions. Any other question? Was this useful to you? Was this, I don't know if I bored you or whatever, but feel free to talk about it because I'm just curious as to, am I touching the right things? Is this value to you? What do you think?
One quick question. I just wanted to get your thoughts on what measures you would be using to compare data which is over 8760. And the data is an actual price versus forecast price, right? So let's say you have a forecast price and an actual price over an 8760 over an entire year. What measures that comes off top of your mind, and you would think like I'll use these measures, like MAPE could be one, mean could be one. What other parameters or things you would want to you would think that you would look at it, given that the things that you talked about, because the thing is, if you try to look for example, in my past experiences, if I try to look at MAPE from a monthly level, it hides many differences that are there on a hourly interval level, right? So those sort of differences, like, okay, this mean or what sort of measures should give you a very good gut feel check thing to pass the smell check, and then if it doesn't pass the smell check, then go for other checks.
Good question. I missed your name. Was that?
Oh, Yogesh.
Oh, Yogesh. Yeah. Okay. So Yogesh, what I do in those kinds of situations is first I ask myself, what is the decision I'm trying to make? I teach a program called Data to Decisions, from Data to Decisions. That's a program I teach very often. So the first question is to ask yourself, what is the decision you are trying to make? Look, the amount of data today can drown the whole world many times over. My goodness, I mean, we are just creating data after data. I'm not saying anything wrong with that. But the trouble is the deluge is so massive that it is very easy to get confused and lost. So the first question I ask is, what is the decision that I'm trying to make? What is the business objective that I'm trying to accomplish? And let's start from there and then find out what is the data set I need, and then get into the nitty-gritty of the conversion from raw data into useful information, which is the processing part. And as I do that, I also pay attention to the nature of the raw data that I have. Okay, for example, if I want to improve the dwell time on my web page, I don't know what industry you are in, but if I want to improve the dwell time on my web page or visitor time, whatever metric you call it, then I need to understand, okay, my y variable, which is the dependent variable, is time. And that is not a qualitative variable. So that is a very crisply measurable quantitative variable. Great. Then I brainstorm and I say, okay, if that is my objective, what are the factors which will influence that objective? And I'll start understanding the factors and how those factors are segmented. Do I have it by month? Do I have it by hour? What makes sense? So if I want to focus on, so let us say I want to focus on the dwell time during holidays. Then I'll try to find that segment of historical data and try to create a model based on that particular y value. So the y value, which is the dependent variable, will be dwell time during, the last 2 weeks of December or something like that. So then I'll go back into my data warehouse and pull selectively only that data that pertains to that particular time frame. There is no sense in just looking at everything and creating a model. That would be totally nonsensical. Am I making sense? Am I giving you some ideas?
Oh, that makes sense. From a high level, I can tell you, right? Like, our aim is always to check the accuracy of your models, right? So, what possible measures you would take to compare or check the accuracy of your model? So, that's where I was coming from.
Oh, the accuracy of the model. Okay, there you go. Okay, so once you have created a model, you backtest it.
Pretty much.
Right? Yeah. So
Yeah.
you create the equation and see the accuracy of the prediction equation.
Yeah.
With your historical data and look at the delta that you get.
Yeah.
Between the actual and the prediction of that equation. Let me see if I can find that spreadsheet. Hold on one second. Find that spreadsheet. You can still see my screen, right? I'm going to show you an Excel spreadsheet. Okay, here we go. Can you see my Excel spreadsheet?
Yep.
Okay. So this particular example that I gave you of the colony forming units, there were 3 variables: temperature, dilution factor, and then time. Okay, sitting over here. So if you look at the raw data, there was the temperature 20, 22, 24, 28, all of that. CFUs, this is the number for CFUs. And this is the delta from the model. What was the model? The model is given over here. This model was y equals 1.25x plus 8.8. Okay, so what you do then is you find the delta between what the model is saying and the observed value. So in this case, the delta was 1.2. For the second, it was 2.2, 1.4, 1, and 0.6. You add that all together and look at the coefficient of variation with regard to the y variable. So all of these were added together, okay? And then as a percentage of CFUs of my y variable, it was 16%. So basically what this is telling me is that this spread is about 16% of my nominal average value, which is not too bad. Compare that with here 85%. So the spread took up 85% of the mean value. So this is a terrible predictor. Okay, dilution factor is a terrible predictor. Although my R squared was pretty good, my R squared is still 0.78. It's not too bad, but the spread is horrible. And this spread over here is 42%. Coefficient of variation is 42%. It's not that great. 16%. So in this case, I have the most confidence in this factor, temperature. So I should not worry about dilution factor. I should not worry about time. I should only worry about temperature. For two reasons. One is that the R squared is good, which is 0.87, okay? And my coefficient of variation is the smallest. So that gives me the highest confidence in using this factor to control CFUs. If you'd like me to explain more, I'm happy to do that, but I think I answered your question in a very succinct manner without drowning ourselves in minutiae.
No, makes sense. Thanks.
Okay, all right. Any other questions?
I've got a two-part question, I guess.
Okay.
Do you do, traditional statistics, or do you do like machine learning? And if you do, what percent of the time do you do like linear regressions or analysis of variance, or do you use like machine learning? Like, do you support vector machines, or can you talk about like what you use the most?
Yeah, my journey on machine learning started about 2 months ago. So I'm very new to that. So honestly speaking, I can't speak a whole lot about it at this point, but in a matter of 1 to 2 years, I think I will be at a point where not only I can speak well about it, I might be able to teach a few elements in machine learning as well. I'm deeply getting into it. It's an area of strong interest for me because that has the potential to completely upset the human mind and our mindsets. Humans will be still around, don't get me wrong, but I think machine learning is really going to upset quite a few things. So I'm getting deeply into it. My journey has started, let me put it that way.
So with the models that you do use, what percent of the time do you use like linear regression or multiple regression versus like analysis of variance and those kinds of?
Yeah, it all depends on the application. If I've got to compare multiple means to find out, let's say I'm looking at 6, 7, 8 factors. I designed a DOE, and that DOE has several factors to it. It includes graphic A versus graphic B, button A versus button B. It includes a certain amount of lines of text. It includes certain word density. So all of those are nothing but variables. And my dependent is click-through rate. My dependents can be multiple variables too. It can be click-through rate. It can be dwell time on the page. It can be then the conversion, not just the click-through rate, but also the conversion. So it all depends on that. Now when I need to compare multiple means, I will resort to using Anova. When I need to look at what factors are driving the dwell time, that is where I will look at multivariate analysis or creating a model with multiple X's in it. And then I need to play around to find out what is the best power, what is the exponent if it applies. In other words, is the relationship all linear or is it non-linear? So at that is the point where I harness jump or Minitab to get me the answers I need. Beyond that, if I need to optimize, let us say the dwell time on a page, then I will start using response surface analysis and the line of steepest ascent. The line of steepest ascent is the approach that gives me the most rapid access to the peak of the response surface. Once you identify the response surface, the other thing then you need to do is the sensitivity. Is the response surface a tip or is the response surface a plateau? Based on that, then I will decide what are the levels of the different factors that I need to set. I don't know if I was able to articulate that in the way that would, that would fit your interest or whatever, but that is going deep into DOE and optimization techniques. That is what I want to automate. And there is some automation I can do in Jump or in Minitab, but there is a lot more ground to cover, and that's why I'm beginning to learn, beginning to get into machine learning. because a lot of that can be automated, and you can run those subroutines to find the most optima. Again, there is a local optima and global optima, so keep that in mind. Many times finding a global optima is almost impossible. So you end up finding local optimas and you go to town with that. Did I answer your question? Or
Pretty
did
much.
did I go off on a tangent somewhere? I
No,
don't
that was good.
know. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. Okay, there is a message came up in chat here. Let me check that. Significant data volumes at detail. Yeah, I do. The question is, I think everybody can see it. Yeah. So when your data starts to overwhelm you, what you do is you resort to what is called sampling techniques. That by itself is a massive subject. Sampling will give you, or can give you, if you do it properly, it can give you a reasonable amount of confidence in the in the analysis that you will do, without really drowning in this ocean of data. So sampling techniques is what I resort to. And if the smell test passes, then I use the sampling technique. If it doesn't pass, then I have to repeat the sampling technique by increasing the data size. And if it still doesn't pass, most likely I will come to the conclusion that this data set is of no use for that particular application or for that particular analysis. I mean, all data is useful. The question is, what are you trying to use it for? All data is not useful for everything. So you have got to know what is it that you are wanting to get out of that data. Am I making sense? Did I answer your question? That was from Fitz, right? Yeah.
I like
Okay.
your statement there, Ray, is that all data is usable, but as long as you know what to actually do with it.
That's correct.
I hear that and see that a lot in my world, where it's like, hey, we're storing 300 million rows of data about doing this. And I'm like, do you actually use it? Or do you just store it? and the answer is no. We haven't seen the first 100 million rows for the last 9 months. We don't really even look at it. We look at the last 2 days, and that's
Good
it.
point. Good
Yeah.
point. So there is another statement just like that, and I'll share that with you. I think you'll get a kick out of this as well. This I learned when I was at DuPont. I worked at DuPont for about 3 years. And one of my colleagues taught me this. He said, and I don't know where he got it from. I'm sure he got it from somewhere. But anyway, he used to say that all models are wrong. Some are more wrong than others.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yep.
Yeah.
Totally true. Some have a higher percentage than others.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. Good deal.
Well, I don't see any other questions. I mean, I guess we give everybody one last chance. Any other questions? Drop them in the chat. Okay, well, I really appreciate it, Ray. I'm very happy that you were able to join us, and it looks like you got some great feedback there about a great presentation.
Thank you.
For everybody else, like I said, the Ray dropped his contact information in there. If you missed that or anything, just feel free to hit me up. You can hit me on Meetup at any time. It's not a problem. You can get to me. And like I said, this recording will be up on YouTube in the next day or so. In case you missed anything, or if you came in late, you can go right back and watch it, and it'll be up there available on YouTube. So. Really appreciate it, Ray. Thank you very much. Thank everybody else for your time, and we hope to see you next month at another meeting.
Thank you, everyone. Hopefully we'll connect sometime.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bye.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Pat.